The silent arrival. History is a circle. It is a wheel that turns slowly, crushing the same ground over and over again. We tend to think of the past as a painting, static, frozen, a collection of dates and battles carved into stone. But for the people who lived it, for the men and women of 1347 or 1665, time was not history. It was simply today. They woke up. They washed their faces in cold basins. They looked out of wooden shutters at the same sun that warms us now. They had no idea that the world was ending. That is the most terrifying thing about the beginning of a plague. It does not announce itself with thunder. It does not arrive with the sound of trumpets or the march of armies. It arrives in silence. It arrives on a gentle wind. It hides in the soft fur of a rat scuttling through the bilge water of a ship. It rides in the breath of a traveler seeking a warm bed. Let us go back. Let us stand on the docks of Messina in Sicily. The year is 1347. October. The air is still warm, thick with the scent of salt and drying fish. The sky is a piercing, innocent blue. Can you hear the sounds? Listen closely. The creak of ropes against wood, the shouting of merchants haggling over spices from the east, the laughter of children chasing dogs through the narrow, shadowed alleys near the harbor. It is a symphony of life, a chaotic, beautiful mess of humanity. People are shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. Touch is everywhere. A handshake to seal a deal, a mother brushing hair from a child's forehead, a lover's hand on a waist in a crowded tavern. Intimacy was survival. No one lived alone. To be alone was to be vulnerable. So they gathered. They clustered in their cities like bees in a hive, warm and safe in their numbers. And then the ships appeared on the horizon. Genoese galleys, 12 of them. They drifted into the harbor, their sails slack. They moved sluggishly, like wounded animals seeking a cave. The dockworkers, the fathers and sons of Messina, ran to the ropes. They were eager for news, eager for trade. They expected silk. They expected spices. They caught the ropes thrown from the decks. They pulled the heavy wood against the stone quay. But when they climbed aboard, the silence hit them first. Chroniclers of the time, Michel de Piazza, a Franciscan friar, tell us what they saw. Men dead at their oars. Bodies blackened and swollen. The few sailors who were still alive could barely speak. They were delirious, burning with a fever that seemed to boil the blood beneath their skin. They carried black boils in their armpits and groins hard, like stones. The people of Messina did not know what they were looking at. They saw sickness, yes, but they did not see the end of their world. They tried to help, because that is human nature. When a man falls, we reach out to catch him. When a stranger is sick, we offer water. And in that act of mercy, in that simple human instinct to help, the door was opened. The rats slipped unnoticed down the ropes. The fleas, invisible and starving, jumped from the dying to the living. By the time the city realized what was happening, by the time the harbor masters ordered the ships to leave, it was already too late. The invisible passenger had disembarked. It walked the streets of Messina. It sat in the taverns. It slept in the beds of the wealthy and the straw mats of the poor. But for the first few days, nothing happened. This is the incubation, the deceptive calm. Imagine the dinner tables that night, families breaking bread, drinking wine, talking about the strange ships perhaps with a shudder of pity, and then moving on to discuss the price of grain or a daughter's wedding. They felt fine. They looked healthy. But the clock had already started ticking. Now shift the scene. Move forward 300 years. London, 1664. The architecture has changed. The clothes are different, but the streets are just as narrow. The filth is just as deep. The city is a labyrinth of timber and plaster, leaning houses that almost touch across the alleyways, shutting out the sky. It is winter. Reports are coming from the continent, rumors, whispers from Amsterdam. They say the sickness is there again. But London is busy. The king has returned. The theaters are open. The taverns are roaring with song. People tell themselves it won't cross the water. The channel is a wall, they think. God is an Englishman, they think. But in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, a poor neighborhood, a few people fall ill. It is December. The cold is biting. 2 men die suddenly. The authorities are nervous. They do not want panic. Panic is bad for trade. Panic upsets the king. So the searchers, poor, elderly women paid to examine the dead, are sent in. They look at the bodies. They see the tokens, the telltale spots. But the official records, the bills of mortality, they do not say plague. They say dropsy. They say fever. A lie. A polite, bureaucratic lie to keep the city calm. And so the city breathes a sigh of relief. It was just a fever. It was just the cold. Life continues. The markets remain packed. The churches remain full. And in the silence of the night, under the cover of that lie, the bacteria multiplies. It moves from house to house, not like a storm, but like a mist. It is patient. It feeds on our denial. Humans have a tremendous capacity to ignore what they fear. If we do not name it, it is not real. If we do not look at it, it cannot see us. So the winter of 1664 turns into the spring of 1665. The weather warms up, and in the warmth the fleas hatch. In Florence, centuries earlier, the writer Boccaccio described this moment of realization. He spoke of how the laws of man and God began to dissolve. But before the dissolution, there is the pause. The moment when the neighbor coughs and the conversation stops. The moment when a shopkeeper does not open his shutters in the morning. The moment when you see a dead rat on your doorstep and you feel a cold shiver of primal recognition. The silence is no longer peaceful. It is heavy. It is pregnant with threat. The birds seem to stop singing. The dogs seem to bark less. In the medieval villages of France, in the stone palazzos of Venice, in the timber houses of London, the atmosphere shifts. The air itself feels different. Chroniclers often described miasma, bad air. They believed the pestilence floated in clouds of foul smell. And so, people began to sniff the air suspiciously. They began to look at each other, not as brothers, not as customers, not as friends, but as vectors. The fear has arrived. It has not yet screamed. It has not yet torn the city apart. It is just standing there, in the corner of the room, watching, waiting for the first person to run. The Great Flight. Denial is fragile. It is a thin sheet of glass. It can hold back the truth for a day, a week, perhaps a month. But eventually, the glass breaks. In London, in the spring of 1665, the breaking sound was not a scream. It was the sound of wheels. Iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones. As the weather turned warmer, the death counts in the weekly bills of mortality began to creep upward. 10, 20, 40. The numbers were still small enough to ignore if you were stubborn, but the aristocracy, they did not wait for the numbers to become undeniable. They had information networks, they had country estates, and most importantly, they had money. The king, Charles II, packed his court. It was a slow, majestic evacuation. Wagons loaded with tapestries, silver, silks, and wine. They left for Oxford. They left for the clean air of the countryside. And when the king leaves, the city's heart stops beating. Panic is contagious. It spreads faster than any microbe. When the shopkeepers saw the gentry packing their trunks, the glass shattered. Suddenly, the streets of London were choked. Imagine the noise. For weeks it had been quiet. Now it was a cacophony of desperation. The road to the northern gates became a river of humanity. Carriages jostled for space. Horses reared in the mud. Pedestrians carrying their entire lives in bundles on their backs wove between the wheels. Everyone had the same look in their eyes. A wide, feral look. They were looking over their shoulders. They believed that the plague was a physical entity, a cloud, a fog, a punishment that hovered specifically over the city limits. If they could just pass the city gates, if they could just reach the green fields, they would be safe. This was the medical advice of the time. Doctors, helpless against the disease, offered a prescription in 3 Latin words. Cedo lunge tard. Leave quickly, go far, return slowly. It was excellent advice for the rich. But what of the poor? What of the baker, the cobbler, the apprentice? Stand on the street corner in London as the carriages roll by. Watch the faces of those left behind. They stand in the doorways of their small, timber-framed houses. They watch the wealth of the city drain away like blood from a wound. They know what this means. When the rich leave, the economy collapses. Work stops, wages stop, charity stops. The city is being abandoned to its fate. Those who stayed, stayed because they were trapped. Anchored by poverty, anchored by duty, or anchored by a fatalistic belief that God had already decided their time. Now let us drift back 3 centuries. To the dusty roads of Italy, 1348. The dynamic was the same. The terror was identical. But the world was wilder. In the countryside of Tuscany, the flight from the cities created a strange, surreal horror. People fled Florence to escape the death in the streets. They ran to isolated villas. They ran to distant relatives in the hills. But often, they brought the death with them. Imagine a traveler. He has walked for 2 days to escape the pestilence in the city. He feels triumphant. He sees the farmhouse of his brother ahead, the smoke rising from the chimney, the safety of the hearth. He arrives, he embraces his family, he eats their food. He feels safe. But that night, he feels a swelling in his groin, a hard knot the size of an apple. He has not escaped, he has merely become the courier. And so the countryside, usually the place of safety, became a place of suspicion. Villages began to lock their gates against strangers. If you walked down a road in 1348, people would not greet you. They would throw stones. They would point pitchforks. Go back, they would scream. Go back to the dying places. The social fabric began to tear. The ancient laws of hospitality, sacred in the medieval world, were suspended. You could knock on a door, begging for water, and hear only the slide of a heavy bolt locking you out. Silence returned to the roads. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of rejection. In London, by June of 1665, the exodus slowed down, not because people wanted to stay, but because the exits were closing. The surrounding towns set up guards. If you came from London, you were not welcome. You were a leper. The Lord Mayor of London issued orders. The city was turning inward. The gates were watched. You could no longer run. And this is when the true psychological horror begins. The realization of entrapment. The city is no longer a home, it is a cage. The walls that were built to keep enemies out now keep the sickness in. And inside that cage, the temperature is rising. The summer heat is beginning to bake the garbage in the streets. The flies are multiplying. And the silence of the night is broken by a new sound. Not the sound of wheels leaving, but the sound of the bell. The passing bell, ringing for the dead. At first it rang occasionally, a solemn, lonely toll. But soon it would ring so often day and night that the air would vibrate with a constant, low-frequency hum of mourning. The trapped population looked at each other. They retreated into their houses. They shut their doors. The great flight was over. The siege had begun. The city is now a prison. But within that prison, there are smaller cells. In London, the authorities made a decision, a brutal, cold calculation. To save the many, they would sacrifice the few. The orders were published. They were pasted onto posts and church doors. The rule was simple. If one person in a house is infected, the house is sealed. Everyone inside, the sick, the healthy, the old, the children, must remain inside. For 40 days. It was a death sentence. Imagine you are a father. Your youngest child has the fever. You see the spots. You know what you must do. By law, you must report it. But if you report it, you doom your wife. You doom your other children. You condemn them to breathe the same stagnant, infected air for a month. So the first reaction is secrecy. Families hid their sick in cellars. They covered the windows with heavy drapes. They bribed the searchers of the dead to write consumption or toothache on the ledger. But you cannot hide the plague forever. Eventually, the screams are heard. Eventually, the doctor is called. And then the painter arrives. He carries a pot of red paint. He walks up to your front door, the door that welcomed friends, the door where you greeted your neighbors. He paints a cross, rough, violent, a foot high, and beneath it or above it, the words required by law. Lord, have mercy upon us. It is a prayer, but it is also a warning branding. It screams to the street, death lives here. And then comes the watchman. The city hired men, often thugs, often desperate men themselves, to stand guard. Day and night. One watchman for the day, one for the night. They sat on a stool outside the painted door. Their job was not to help. Their job was to ensure that no one came out. If you tried to leave, if you tried to lower a child out of a back window, the watchman would be there. He would force you back in with a halberd. Inside the sealed house, time distorts. It is a psychological torture that we can barely comprehend. Imagine the atmosphere in the parlor. The shutters are closed. The room is dark, lit only by a tallow candle. The air is thick with the smell of vinegar. People believed vinegar could purify the air. They sprinkled it on the floor. They soaked cloths in it and held them to their faces. They burned rosemary. They burned brimstone. The house was choked with acrid smoke. And in the corner, on the bed, the sick person lies, groaning, delirious. The healthy family members press themselves against the far walls. They watch. Every cough is a gunshot. Every movement is a threat. They cannot sleep. To sleep is to be vulnerable. They listen to the breathing of the dying. And they wait for the itch. They wait for the headache. They wait for the sudden sharp pain in the armpit that signals their own end. The house becomes a tomb before anyone has even died. In the Italian cities of the 14th century, the cruelty was different. In Florence, Boccaccio tells us that the terror was so great, it broke the bonds of blood. There were no watchmen there. There was only abandonment. Fathers left sons, wives left husbands. They simply walked out the door and never looked back, leaving the sick to die in empty houses, alone in their thirst. But in London, the enforced togetherness was the horror. Sometimes the watchmen were corrupt. Stories are told of families lowering money in a bucket from an upper window, bribing the guard to look away while they escaped over the rooftops. But mostly they stayed. They watched the Red Cross fade in the rain. And the silence of the street deepened. Because as more houses were sealed, the traffic vanished. The carts stopped, the hawkers stopped shouting. And then a strange phenomenon occurred. Something that chroniclers mentioned with a sense of awe and unease. Grass. Grass began to grow between the cobblestones of the major streets. The thoroughfares of London, once beaten hard by thousands of feet and hooves, turned green. Nature was reclaiming the city. The silence was now so profound that you could hear the rushing of the water under the London Bridge from streets away. You could hear the wind moving through the empty market stalls. The city was holding its breath. And in that silence, the only movement was the smoke rising from the chimneys of the sealed houses, and the slow, steady approach of the night. Because the night brought a new sound, the only traffic allowed, the heavy, rumbling wheels of the dead cart. The night shift. Daylight offers a small mercy. In the day, you can see the sky. You can see the birds, indifferent to human suffering, flying over the rooftops. But the night strips away all hope. In 1665 London, there were no streetlights. When the sun went down, the city plunged into a heavy, suffocating darkness. The only light came from the moon and the flickering torches of the men who did the work that no one else would do. Listen. The silence of the curfew is broken by a sound that every citizen learned to dread. The iron clatter of wheels. Not the fast, rhythmic clip-clop of a carriage, but the slow, lumbering roll of a heavy wagon. And then the voice, rough, tired, echoing off the timber walls. Bring out your dead. It was a command, a summons. In the sealed houses, the families were waiting. They had wrapped the bodies of their loved ones in whatever they had, a linen sheet, a coarse blanket, sometimes just a sack. There were no coffins. Coffins were a luxury of the past. There was no wood left. There were no carpenters willing to build them. When the cart stopped in front of the door, the interaction was brief. There was no funeral service, no priest, no prayer. Just the heavy thud of a body being lifted onto the pile. It was a moment of supreme indignity. In the medieval mind, the good death was everything. You needed last rites. You needed to be buried in consecrated ground facing east, waiting for the resurrection. The plague stole the good death. It turned humans into cargo. The cart moves on. It winds through the labyrinth of streets, collecting its toll until the wheels are groaning under the weight. And where does it go? It goes to the edge of the parish, to the fields that used to be for grazing sheep or practicing archery. Now they are the pits. The great pit of Aldgate, the Finsbury pit. Huge, gaping wounds in the earth. If you stood at the edge of the Aldgate pit in September of 1665, you would see a scene from hell itself. Torches stuck into the mounds of earth, casting long, dancing shadows. The barriers, often drunk on brandy to numb the horror, tipping the cart. The bodies slide, they tumble into the darkness. Rich and poor, young and old. The merchant who owned the ship, and the sailor who rowed it. The plague is the great equalizer. In the pit, silk rots next to rags. There is no distinction. There is no hierarchy. Only the lime. They threw quicklime over the bodies to speed up the decomposition, to seal the smell, to burn away the sickness. A white dust settling over the dead. In 1348, the Italian chronicler Agnolo di Tura wrote about this with a heartbreaking simplicity. He said, "They were buried with little earth, and the dogs dragged them forth and devoured their bodies." He dug graves for 5 of his own children with his own hands. He said, "No one wept for any dead, for all expected to die." That is the breaking point of a civilization. When the tears stop. When grief is replaced by a numb, cold acceptance. Back in London, the cart returns to the depot. The night fades. The sun rises again. And the survivors look out of their windows at the empty street. The cart is gone. The bodies are gone. The street looks exactly as it did yesterday. But inside the houses, there is an empty chair, an empty bed. And the survivors wash their faces. They eat their stale bread. And they wait. because they know the sun will set again, and the cart will return. The doctor's mask. Fear creates a market. When the priest stopped answering prayers, and the city officials stopped answering frantic knocks at the door, the people turned to anyone who promised survival. In the midst of the dying cities, a strange industry bloomed. The industry of cures. If you walked through the markets of London before they closed, or the piazzas of Venice, you would see them. Charlatans, quacks, desperate apothecaries. They stood on crates, shouting over the sound of the coughing crowds. They sold hope in small glass bottles. Unicorn horn, they cried, it was powdered bone. Viper flesh, it was dried snake. Arsenic cakes, to be worn near the heart, not eaten. People bought them. They spent their last coins. They traded their wedding rings. Because when you are drowning, you will grab onto a blade of grass to keep yourself afloat. And then there was the figure that haunts our nightmares to this day. The plague doctor. We know the image, the long black coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the stick. And the mask. The beak. It looks like a demon, a bird of prey staring out of hollow glass eyes. But it was not designed to be scary. It was designed to be a filter. Medical theory at the time believed in miasma. They believed the plague was a poison in the air, a sticky, foul-smelling vapor that clung to clothes and entered through the nose. So the beak was a gas mask. Inside that long leather nose, they stuffed straw. Straw soaked in vinegar, dried flowers, laudanum, spices from the east. They breathed through a filter of perfume, trying to scrub the death out of the air before it hit their lungs. Imagine standing in a bedroom in 1665. You are sick, you are terrified. The door opens, and this thing walks in. He does not touch you with his hands. He pokes you with a white wooden cane. He lifts your shirt with the stick to check for the boils. He is a doctor, but he looks like the angel of death. He cannot speak clearly through the mask. His voice is muffled, distant. He prescribes a poultice of onions and butter. Or perhaps he bleeds you, draining the bad blood into a bowl. And then he leaves. He walks back out into the infected street, his leather coat sweeping the cobblestones. And often he dies too. The beak did not work. The spices did not work. In London, a different madness took hold. Tobacco. It was rumored that tobacconists never died of the plague. And so the city began to smoke. It was a surreal sight. Men, women, even children. At Eton College, one of the most prestigious schools in England, the schoolboys were ordered to smoke pipes in the morning. Imagine a classroom of 10-year-old boys, forced to smoke tobacco until they were sick and dizzy. If they refused, they were whipped. It was a desperate, inverted logic. Poison yourself with smoke to keep out the greater poison. But go back further. Go back to 1349, Germany, France. When the medicine failed, when the herbs failed, people turned to the ultimate bargaining chip. Blood. The flagellants appeared on the roads. They were a procession of ghosts, hundreds of men walking 2 by 2. They wore white hoods. They carried heavy leather scourges, whips with iron spikes knotted into the tails. They did not run from the plague. They marched toward it. They walked into the town squares. They stripped to the waist. And in a rhythmic chanting trance, they beat themselves. Smack, smack, smack. The blood ran down their backs. It splattered onto the onlookers. They believed that the plague was an arrow sent by God, a punishment for the sins of the world. If they punished themselves first, if they bled voluntarily, perhaps God would put down his bow. The crowds watched in silence. Some wept. Some dipped cloths in the blood, thinking it was holy. But the fleas did not care about penance. The fleas jumped from the bloody rags of the flagellants to the robes of the townspeople. The procession moved on, singing their dirges. And behind them, in the silence they left, the death rate spiked. They were not saviors. They were super spreaders. The death of touch. When the fear runs deep enough, it kills the most fundamental human language. Touch. For thousands of years, trade was a physical act. You handed a coin, you took a loaf of bread, hand to hand, warmth to warmth. But in the plague years, the hand of another man became a weapon. The markets of London, of Florence, of Marseille, they did not just empty, they mutated. Commerce had to survive, but it had to survive without contact. Go to the edge of a quarantined town. Go to the boundaries. Here you will see a strange ritual. A line of stones placed on the ground. On one side, the country farmers, they have meat, they have grain, they are healthy, suntanned, terrified. On the other side, the city dwellers, pale, gaunt, hungry. They do not approach each other. They shout across the dead space. A sack of flour. A side of beef. The goods are placed on a rock. The farmer steps back, far back. The city dweller steps forward. He takes the food. But he does not leave money in the farmer's hand. He drops the coins into a bowl of vinegar, or sometimes into a hollowed-out stone filled with water. They believed the water would wash the sickness off the metal. They watched the coin sink, the silver glinting through the liquid. Only when the buyer was gone would the farmer approach to fish out the money with tongs. It was a transaction of ghosts. Inside the cities, the paranoia was even more intimate. The breath became the enemy. People began to hold their breath when they passed strangers in the alley. They walked in the middle of the street, avoiding the overhang of the houses, fearing that the bad air might drop from an open window like rain. In the taverns that remained open, illicitly, secretly, the cups were no longer shared. The communal bowl, the symbol of brotherhood, vanished. And inside the home, this is the cruelest cut. The dinner table, once the center of family life, became a minefield. If a child sneezed, the spoon stopped moving. The eyes of the mother, the father, the siblings, they all darted to the sound. Was it dust? Was it a cold? Or was it it? Boccaccio wrote that fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children, as though they did not belong to them. Imagine that. The instinct to protect your offspring, overridden by a primal, lizard-brain panic. In 1665, there are records of servants being thrown out into the street the moment they looked pale. Young girls, loyal for years, cast out into the rain, locked out of the house they cleaned, left to die on the cobblestones because the master was afraid. The dog was treated better than the servant. The cat was treated better than the sister. Isolation is not just about being alone in a room. True isolation is being in a room full of people and knowing that not one of them will touch you if you fall. The silence of the city was now matched by the silence of the heart. Empathy was drying up. It was a resource as scarce as firewood. And as the compassion died, the superstition grew. People began to see signs in everything. A comet in the sky, a warning. A raven on the thatch, a message. A loaf of bread that rose too high in the oven, an omen. The rational mind was shutting down. The primal mind was taking over. They were looking for a reason, any reason. Why us? Why now? And when people look for a reason, and they cannot find one in nature, they start to look for a scapegoat. The enemy within. When a man cannot fight the wind, he finds something he can hit. The plague was invisible. It had no face. It had no neck to throttle. And so the terror turned into rage. If God was punishing the world, there must be a reason. Someone must be responsible. Someone must have opened the door. In 1348, as the Black Death swept across Europe, The silence of the sick room was replaced by the roar of the mob. The whisper began in the marketplaces. They are poisoning the wells. It was a lie, a clean, simple lie that explained everything. The focus turned to the outsiders, the travelers, and most tragically, the Jewish communities of Europe. In Strasbourg, in Basel, in Mainz, the madness took hold. People who had lived as neighbors for decades suddenly looked across the street and saw enemies. They believed that if they purged the poisoners, the sickness would stop. It was mass hysteria, a collective hallucination born of grief. The fires were lit. In Strasbourg, on a cold Valentine's Day in 1349, the sky turned black with smoke, not from the plague pits, but from the execution pyres. The mob watched. They felt a grim sense of justice. They believed they were cleaning the city. But the next day, the plague killed just as many. And the day after that, it killed more. The scapegoat was dead, but the flea remained. Now shift forward again. London, 1665. The enemy was different here. The English did not blame the wells. They blamed the companions. The Lord Mayor of London, desperate to be seen doing something, looked at the streets. He saw dogs, he saw cats. He believed that these animals carried the pestilence in their fur. So the order was given. A war was declared on nature. The dog killers were hired. Men with iron bars and sacks roamed the silent alleys. Listen to the sound of London now. It is not the sound of traffic. It is the yelping of 40,000 dogs. The domestic pets, the spaniels that slept at the foot of the bed, the mongrels that guarded the shops, they were dragged out. People surrendered their animals. They handed over their loyal protectors with tears in their eyes, believing it was necessary to save their children. The cats were next. 200,000 cats, hunted down, clubbed, piled into heaps on the street corners. The city was littered with the bodies of the only creatures that could have saved them. This is the great, tragic irony of 1665. The cats and the dogs were the predators of the rat. They were the first line of defense. By killing them, London signed its own death warrant. With the cats gone, the rats exploded. They came out of the cellars. They came out of the sewers. They ran freely through the grain stores. And on their backs the fleas danced. The Lord Mayor had cleared the path for the enemy. The silence of the streets became absolute. No barking, no meowing. Just the scuttling of claws on wood. And the humans, locked in their houses, waited. They had killed the strangers. They had killed the animals. They had run out of things to blame. Now there was nothing left to do but face the mirror. And in the mirror, they saw the symptoms appearing on their own bodies. The tokens, the purple spots. They looked like bruises, small, round, indelible. The doctors called them God's marks. If you found one on your chest while dressing in the morning, you did not bother to scream. You simply went back to bed. You pulled the sheet up. And you waited for the delirium to take you away from the horror of the world you had helped to break. The silent steeple. In the medieval mind, the church was not just a building. It was the engine of the world. It marked the hours, it blessed the crops, it baptized the bobbies, it buried the dead. It was the one place where fear was supposed to end and hope was supposed to begin. But the plague did not respect the sanctuary. In fact, it loved the church. Think of Sunday Mass in a crowded parish, 500 people packed into tight wooden pews, kneeling, chanting, breathing the same incense, drinking from the same chalice. The church became the most dangerous place in the city. And then the priests began to fall. This was the supreme psychological shock for the common people. They believed the priests were protected. They were the intermediaries. They were closer to God. But when the parishioners saw the vicar collapse at the altar, or when the confession booth sat empty for weeks, the spiritual foundation of their lives cracked. In 1348, the mortality rate among the clergy was horrific. Why? Because they did their job. They went into the sick rooms to hear the last confessions. They leaned close to the dying to catch their whispered sins. They breathed the breath of the infected. And so they died in droves. In Montpellier, France, every single friar in the local monastery died. 7 gates were open, 7 monks walked through, none walked back. And then the replacements came. But they were not the same. The experienced, compassionate priests were gone. In their place came hastily ordained boys, or greedy men who charged exorbitant fees for a funeral mass. The sanctity was draining away. In London, 1665, the authorities made a chilling decision regarding the sound of the city. For months, the bells had been ringing. The heavy iron tolling, dong dong dong. It went on for 24 hours a day. It drove the citizens mad. It was a constant auditory reminder of the slaughter. You could not eat, you could not sleep, you could not think without the rhythm of death in your ears. So they banned the bells. The order went out, no more ringing for the dead. The city fell into a new, artificial silence. Now when a neighbor died, there was no announcement, no community mourning. Just the quiet creak of the door, the quiet shuffle of feet. The dead simply vanished. It was as if the city was trying to erase the evidence. And the rituals of the grave, they were abandoned entirely. In the great pit of Aldgate, the bodies were now being stacked like firewood. There was no time for individual graves, no time for headstones. There was certainly no time for a coffin. A contemporary writer described looking into the pit and seeing the bodies, packed as tight as goods in the hold of a ship. The dignity of the individual was erased. You were no longer John the baker or Mary the weaver. You were just biomass. This erosion of ritual had a profound effect on the survivors. If there is no funeral, is the person really gone? If there is no prayer, where does the soul go? A heavy, atheistic dread began to settle over the population. Not that they stopped believing in God, but they began to believe that God had stopped listening. They felt abandoned, like children left alone in a dark house. The churches stood open, but they were silent. Dust settled on the altars. The candles burned down to wax puddles, and no one replaced them. The gargoyles on the roof looked down at the empty streets, grinning their stone grins. They were the only ones who seemed at home in this new world. The connection between the earth and the sky had been severed. And down on the ground, in the mud and the filth, the people realized something terrifying. They were on their own. The feast of FOLS. When the law breaks, strange flowers grow in the cracks. For months the people lived in terror. They whispered, they prayed, they hid. But the human mind can only sustain maximum terror for so long. Eventually, the adrenaline burns out. The fear curdles into something else. It turns into nihilism. If the priest says God is angry, and the doctor says there is no cure, and the magistrate is dead, then what is the point of following the rules? Why save money if you won't live to spend it? Why be sober if reality is a nightmare? In Florence in 1348, the city split into 2 tribes. There were the shut-ins. They locked their doors. They ate only bread and drank only clear wine. They spoke in whispers and avoided all news of the outside. They tried to create a bubble of sanity. And then there were the others, the drinkers. They decided that the best medicine was laughter, song, and wine. They roamed the city. Imagine walking into a grand palazzo in Florence. The owner, a wealthy merchant, has fled to the country or died in the first wave. The door is unlocked. Strangers walk in. They are not thieves in the traditional sense. They do not take the gold to sell it. They take the house to use it. They sit in the velvet chairs. They light the expensive beeswax candles. They go down to the cellar and tap the casks of vintage wine. They feast. They sing loud, raucous songs to drown out the silence of the street. It was a dance macabre, a dance of death. They believed that if they were happy, if they were drunk, the plague could not catch them. In London, 1665, the moral collapse took a darker turn. Crime. The city was full of empty houses. Houses where entire families had died, leaving behind silver plates, jewelry, and coins hidden in the mattress. The nurses, the women hired to care for the sick, often became the predators. Stories were whispered in the taverns. A nurse waiting for the patient to die. A nurse pulling the ring off a finger before the hand was cold. Or worse, accelerating the process with a wet pillow just to finish the shift and take the spoils. The watchmen, too, were easily bought. If you gave a watchman a bottle of gin, he might look the other way while you looted the house next door. People began to wear clothes that did not belong to them. You would see a rough laborer walking down the street in the silk waistcoat of a gentleman. You would see a woman of the streets wearing the pearls of a merchant's wife. It was a carnival of ghosts. The social hierarchy was dissolving. The plague made everyone equal in death, so the survivors decided to be equal in life. But this freedom was manic, it was brittle. Look closely at the faces of the drinkers in the tavern. They are laughing too loud. Their eyes are too wide. They are not happy. They are hysterical. They are drinking to forget the itch on their skin. They are drinking to ignore the swelling in their groin. And sometimes, right there in the middle of a toast, the cup drops. The laughter stops. A man collapses onto the table. The others do not help him. They do not mourn him. They simply move away. They grab the bottle and they run to the next house. To keep the party going. To keep the silence at bay for one more hour. Because if the music stops, they will have to hear the sound of their own heartbeat. And in 1665, your own heartbeat was the most terrifying sound in the world. The furnace. August. In the year 1665, the summer did not break. It was a cruel, relentless season. The sun beat down on the timber roofs of London with a hammer's weight. There was no rain, there was no wind. The air in the narrow streets became stagnant. It sat heavy between the houses, trapping the heat and trapping the smell. The smell. Chroniclers struggled to describe it. It was not just the smell of the dead, though that was part of it. The shallow graves in the pits were bursting. The soil could no longer contain what was buried beneath it. But it was also the smell of a city that had stopped cleaning itself. Garbage piled up in the gutters, offal from the butchers, rotting vegetables in the abandoned markets. And the smell of fear itself, the sweat of the sick, the vinegar, the smoke of the fires. It formed a physical miasma, a yellow-gray haze that hung over the rooftops at dawn. The heat incubated the horror. The flies arrived. Clouds of them. Blue bottles, fat, buzzing, iridescent. They covered the meat left on the tables. They landed on the faces of the sleeping. They landed on the lips of the dying. To the people trapped in the city, the flies seemed like emissaries of the devil. They moved from the corpse in the gutter to the food on the plate. Buzzing, always buzzing. The sound of the flies replaced the sound of the traffic. It was the soundtrack of August. In this furnace, the death toll reached its peak. The bills of mortality for 1 week in September recorded over 7,000 deaths. 7,000 in 1 week. And that was an undercount. The real number was likely double that. The clerks could not write fast enough. The searchers could not count fast enough. At this point, the city began to lose its mind. People reported hallucinations. They looked up at the bright, cloudless blue sky, the mocking blue sky, and they saw things. They saw coffins floating in the clouds. They saw flaming swords. They saw ghosts walking in the graveyards at noon. One man ran naked through the streets of London, a brazier of burning coals on his head, shouting, "Oh, the great and the dreadful God!" No one stopped him. No one arrested him. He was just another phantom in the heat. The River Thames, usually the lifeline of the city, flowed slowly. It was low, muddy. The ships that usually crowded the Pool of London were gone. The masts that looked like a forest were stripped away. The river was empty. The city was an island of death, cut off from the world by a ring of fear and a wall of heat. Inside the houses, the water in the barrels went stale. The bread went hard. People sat in their underclothes, sweating, waiting. They watched the candle melt. They watched the sun move across the floorboards. They had stopped praying for mercy. Now they just prayed for rain. They prayed for a storm, a gale, anything to break the stillness, anything to wash the air clean. But the sky remained blue, and the sun continued to stare down, like an unblinking eye, watching the ants burn under the magnifying glass. The purification BY fire. When the heat became unbearable, they decided to add fire. It was the logic of desperation. The doctors and the magistrates gathered. They looked at the dying city. They looked at the blue, stagnant sky. They concluded that the air itself was rotten. The miasma was too thick. It was hanging low in the streets, heavy and poisonous. If the wind would not blow it away, they would burn it away. September 1665. The order was given by the Lord Mayor. Fires, not for warmth, but for purification. The decree was specific. For every 6 houses, a fire must be lit in the center of the street. It must be kept burning, day and night. And so the sun went down, and the city lit up. Imagine the visual. Stand on the banks of the Thames and look north toward the city. Usually London at night is a black void, dotted with faint candles. Now it is glowing. A deep, throbbing orange light pulsates from the narrow alleys. Smoke rises in thick, black columns, joining together to form a blanket over the rooftops. They burned everything they had. Coal, wood, but also strong-smelling things. They believed the smell of the plague had to be overpowered. They threw brimstone into the flames, gunpowder, pitch. They threw onions, garlic, hops. The air of London turned acrid. It stung the eyes. It burned the throat. Walking down the street was like walking through a battlefield. On every corner, a pile of coals glowing red. And around the fires, the watchmen. Silhouettes against the flames. They poked the embers with long iron rods. They looked like demons tending the furnaces of hell. The shadow danced on the timber walls of the houses. Inside the sealed houses, the people saw the flickering light through the cracks in their shutters. They could smell the smoke. For a moment, there was hope. They thought, this is it. This is the cure. The fire is eating the sickness. People came to their windows. They breathed deep, sucking in the sulfurous smoke, praying that it would scrub their lungs clean. But fire does not kill the flea. The rat does not mind the smoke. It simply scurries deeper into the cellar. It hides in the cool dark of the walls. The fires burned for 3 days. The city was hot, choking. The eyes of the citizens were red and weeping from the fumes. And then the rain finally came. Not a gentle shower, but a storm. It extinguished the fires. It turned the ash into black sludge in the gutters. The smoke cleared, and the people looked around. The fires were out, but the red crosses on the doors were still there. The wagons were still rolling. The purification had failed. It had only succeeded in making the city look like what it felt like. An inferno. And now, with the fires dead and the wood wet, the cold began to creep back in. And with the cold came the realization that science, medicine, and fire had all failed. There was nothing left to try. The city slumped into a deep, exhausted depression. They stopped fighting. They simply waited for the end. The village of silence. While the great cities burned their fires and screamed in the night, the plague traveled quietly down the country roads. It sat in the saddlebags of messengers. It hid in the folds of second-hand clothes sold by peddlers. And sometimes it arrived in a box. Let us leave London. Let us leave the noise of the capital. Travel north to the green, rolling hills of Derbyshire. To a small village, Iam. It is 1665, late summer. The village is a tight cluster of stone cottages. The air is sweet. The sheep graze on the moors. The plague feels like a rumor here, a distant thunderstorm that will never reach them. But then the tailor receives a parcel. It is a box of cloth sent from London, patterns for the new season. The tailor's assistant opens it. He notices the cloth is damp. It must have been raining in London when it was packed. He hangs the cloth in front of the fire to dry. As the heat hits the wool, the passengers wake up. The fleas. Within a week, the assistant is dead. Within a month, the tailor is dead. The sickness begins to jump from cottage to cottage. And here, in this small, isolated valley, humanity makes a choice that echoes through history. The villagers gather. They stand in the churchyard. They look at their rector. They know the truth. The plague is here. If they run, they will save themselves. But they will carry the seed to the next town, to Sheffield, to the north. If they stay, they will likely die. So they draw a line. Literally. They map out a circle of stones around the village, a perimeter of half a mile. And they make a vow. No one crosses the line. No one comes in. No one goes out. They choose to become a prison. This is not the forced imprisonment of the London houses, with guards and red crosses. This is a voluntary siege, a suicide pact made for the sake of strangers. The days turn into weeks. The village goes quiet. The neighbors in the surrounding towns, they watch from the hills. They are terrified. They come to the boundary stones. They leave food. They leave messages. But they do not step across. Inside the circle, the horror is absolute. Because there is no escape, the virus is trapped in a bowl. Families dig graves in their own gardens. There is no one left to carry the coffins to the church. A woman named Elizabeth Hancock. In the space of 8 days, she watches her husband and her 6 children die. 6 children. There is no one to help her. The neighbors are too weak or too afraid. So she digs the graves herself. She drags the bodies of her sons and daughters through the grass. She lowers them into the earth. She reads the Bible over them. And then she goes back into the empty house. She survives. She sits alone in a house that used to be full of noise and laughter. She is the queen of a ghost town. The village of Iam lost 260 people, more than half its population. But the plague stopped. It stopped at the stones. It did not reach Sheffield. It did not devour the north. The silence of Iam was a shield. A cold, heavy, tragic shield constructed of human bones. And when the outsiders finally dared to enter the village, months later, they found the grass growing tall in the streets. They found the doors swinging in the wind. They found a stillness that felt holy. Because the people of Iam had proven something. That in the face of the ultimate biological cruelty, the human spirit can still choose dignity. They died so that others could live. And the silence they left behind is the loudest sound in history. The frozen silence. Fire did not kill the plague. The cold did. Or at least, the cold made it sleep. November came, then December. The furnace of summer finally broke. The skies turned gray. The wind shifted, blowing hard from the north, bringing the bite of frost. In the countryside, the leaves fell from the trees, revealing the skeletons of the branches. In the cities, the mud in the streets froze into hard, jagged ruts. And with the frost, the death toll began to drop. The fleas, sluggish in the cold, stopped jumping. The rats retreated deeper into their burrows for warmth. The weekly bills of mortality in London began to show the numbers falling. 7,000, then 5,000, then 3. It was not a sudden stop. It was a slow, stuttering deceleration. But for the survivors, the winter brought a new kind of cruelty. Hunger. The economy had been dead for 6 months. No harvest had been brought in. No trade ships had docked. The pantries were empty. The people who had survived the sickness now faced the prospect of starving in the cold. Imagine the atmosphere of a London Christmas in 1665. There were no feasts, no carols sung in the streets. People sat huddled around small fires. Fuel was expensive, and wood was scarce because so much had been burned in the purification bonfires. They wore their coats inside. They watched their breath mist in the air. And they looked at the empty chairs. This is the season of the great counting. During the panic, there was no time to mourn. You focused on your own breath, your own heartbeat. But now, in the quiet of winter, the adrenaline faded, and the grief rushed in. You realized that your favorite baker was gone. The woman who sold lavender was gone. Your brother, your cousin, your priest. The city felt hollowed out. Walking through London in the snow was a surreal experience. Whole rows of houses stood dark, no smoke from the chimneys, no footprints on the doorstep. The doors swung open in the wind, banging against the frames. Bang, bang. Inside, the furniture was still there. The plates were on the table, but the life was gone. These were the tomb houses. Scavengers moved through them like ghosts, taking what they wanted, but even the looters were tired. There was a heaviness in the air that not even the cold wind could lift. It was the weight of absence. In the 14th century, after the first wave of the Black Death, chroniclers wrote about the deep silence that fell over the world. They wrote that the world felt widowed. The fields were overgrown. The cattle wandered loose, unmilked and feral. Wolves came closer to the villages, sensing the lack of men. The balance of nature had shifted. Man was no longer the master. He was just a survivor, shivering in the dark. But in this frozen landscape, a tiny spark of normalcy began to return. A shop opened. A blacksmith struck a piece of iron, clang. The sound echoed for miles. People stopped in the street. They turned their heads. It was the sound of the future returning. Tentative, fragile. But there, the unwelcome guests. Spring 1666. The sun returns, the frost melts. And with the warmth, the wheels return. The king flows back into London. The court returns. The merchants who fled to their country estates begin to trickle back. They expect a welcome. They expect the city to be grateful for their money, for their noise, for their business. But they are met with a cold, hard stare. The city has changed. The people who stayed, the people who survived the siege, they have formed a grim brotherhood. They are the veterans of the nightmare. They have seen things that the runaways cannot imagine. They have smelled the burning bodies. They have heard the screams in the night. And now they watch the carriages roll in. They see the healthy, rosy faces of the rich. They see their clean clothes, their fattened horses. And they feel a deep, burning resentment. Where were you? Their eyes ask. Where were you when the carts were rolling? The social contract has been broken. The leavers try to act as if nothing happened. They bustle about, ordering servants to air out their houses, demanding fresh bread, complaining about the dust. But the stayers move slowly. They do not smile. When a wealthy merchant walks into a shop that has just reopened, there is a pause, a hesitation. The shopkeeper takes the money, but he does not bow as low as he used to. He knows that death does not care about rank. He has seen the bodies of aldermen thrown into the same pit as the bodies of beggars. The hierarchy has been exposed as a fiction. And physically, the return is a violent act. Remember the grass. The grass that had grown so beautifully between the cobblestones of the main streets. The returning wheels crushed it. Within a week the green was gone, churned back into brown, stinking mud. The city was being paved over again. The evidence of the silence was being erased. But inside the houses of the returnees, the past was waiting. Imagine opening the door of a townhouse that has been locked for 6 months. The air rushes out, stale, cold, smelling of old wax and dead mice. A cup sits on the table, exactly where it was left in the panic of the flight. A layer of dust covers everything, gray, thick. The servants are sent in first, to sweep, to scrub, to open the windows. They burn vinegar again, not for the plague this time, but to remove the smell of abandonment. But there is a danger here. The plague is not a soldier that simply marches away. It is a guerrilla fighter. It hides. It hides in the heavy wool curtains. It hides in the mattress stuffing. It hides in the rugs. There were cases, tragic, cruel cases, of families returning to London in the spring of 1666, believing they were safe. They entered their homes, they slept in their beds. And the dormant fleas, hungry after a long winter, woke up. The return plague. It did not kill thousands, but it killed enough to keep the terror alive. It was a reminder. You can run, you can hide, you can come back when the coast is clear. But the house remembers. The city remembers. And as the population swelled back to its pre-plague levels, a new anxiety took hold. The crowdedness. Before the plague, the crowds were annoying. Now they were terrifying. Every time a stranger brushed against you in the market, you flinched. Every time someone coughed in church, heads turned. The trust was gone. London was a city of survivors, pretending to be a city of neighbors. But under the surface, everyone was still holding their breath, waiting for the heat to rise again. The dance macabre. When the dying stops, the dancing begins. But it is not a dance of joy. It is a dance of defiance. In the years following the Black Death of 1348, a new kind of art appeared on the walls of churches and cemeteries across Europe. You have seen it. The dance macabre, the dance of death. Skeletons grinning, dancing skeletons. They hold hands with the living. They take the hand of the king. They take the hand of the bishop, the merchant, the peasant, the child. The message was brutal and simple. Mors vincit omnia. Death conquers all. It did not matter how much gold you had buried in your cellar. It did not matter how high your castle walls were. The skeleton was always waiting to cut in. In London, in the summer of 1666, this philosophy took hold of the streets. The survivors had stared into the abyss, and now they wanted to drink the cup of life to the dregs. A strange frenzy seized the population. The plague weddings. The churches, silent for so long, were suddenly busy, but not with funerals. With marriages. Widowers married widows. Men who had lost their wives married the servants who had survived with them. It was not driven by romance. It was driven by a biological panic. The city felt empty. The houses felt too quiet. There was a desperate, primal need to fill the void, to replace the children who had been lost, to merge the businesses that had been left without heirs. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, was no longer just a proverb. It was a survival strategy. The taverns of London, which had been places of fear, became places of excess. People spent money they didn't have. They wore bright colors. The chronicler Samuel Pepys, who lived through it all, wrote about the strange mood. He wrote about buying new wigs, new clothes, flirting with women, even as the graves were still fresh. It was a form of collective PTSD. They were trying to outrun their memories. But beneath the frantic energy, the city was rotting. London in 1666 was a tinderbox. Think about the physical state of the city. For a year, maintenance had stopped. The wooden houses were dry. The summer of 1666 was even hotter than the summer of 1665. The timber frames were baked brittle by the sun. And the cellars, they were full of fuel. During the plague, people had hoarded coal, wood, and oil, fearing they would be locked in for months. Now those stockpiles were still there, sitting in the dark basements. And the cure itself had added to the danger. Remember the pitch, the tar, the brimstone. The substances used to purify the air and seal the houses were highly flammable. The city was covered in a layer of sticky, combustible residue. It was waiting. The plague had tried to kill the people. Now the city itself seemed ready to die. The atmosphere in August 1666 was electric, stormy without rain. There was a sense of doom that hadn't lifted. Prophets walked the streets again, warning of a second punishment. They said that fire would follow the pestilence. Most people laughed at them. They were too busy living, too busy rebuilding. But the rats, the survivors of the purge, they were still there. And now they were not carrying fleas. They were gnawing on the dry wood of the bakery walls. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The tragedy of the plague was over. The tragedy of the fire was about to begin. The Red Cure. It began with the smell of bread, and it ended with the smell of a city turned to ash. September 2nd, 1666. A Sunday morning, not yet dawn. The city of London is sleeping. It is exhausted. It has survived the plague, the winter, and the poverty. But in a small shop on Pudding Lane, a spark falls. It falls from the oven of Thomas Farriner, the king's baker. It lands on a pile of brushwood. It is a small thing, a candle's worth of flame. In any other year, it would have been stomped out with a boot. But this is 1666. The wood is dry as bone. The walls are coated in the pitch and tar used to seal the plague houses. The fire breathes. It grows. It climbs the timber frames. It jumps across the narrow alleyway to the stables at the Star Inn. And then the wind wakes up. A strong, dry wind from the east. It grabs the fire and pushes it, not a creep but a run. By morning, the fire is no longer an accident. It is a monster. And here lies the terrible, burning irony. The fire headed straight for the poorest, filthiest districts. It headed for the rookeries, the slums, the wharves. These were the exact neighborhoods where the Black Death had lived. These were the nests of the rats, the breeding grounds of the fleas. The fire moved through them like a furious surgeon. It did not discriminate, it simply erased. Imagine the sound. The plague was silent, the fire was deafening. A constant, low-frequency roar like a storm at sea, the popping of timber, the explosion of stones cracking in the heat. And the rats. Witnesses described seeing them. Thousands of them, pouring out of the burning cellars, running into the river, squealing. For 2 years they had been the kings of the city, unstoppable, invisible. Now they were burning. The vector of the disease was being cauterized. The people fled again. A second exodus. They ran to the river. They piled their goods onto boats. But this time, they were not running from an invisible miasma. They were running from a wall of heat that could be felt on the face from a mile away. The sky turned black with smoke. The sun looked like a drop of blood. St. Paul's Cathedral, the great stone heart of London, caught fire. The lead roof melted. The molten lead ran down the streets like a silver river. The stones exploded like grenades. The tombs of the ancestors cracked open. It was apocalyptic. It looked to the terrified citizens like the final judgment, first the pestilence, then the fire. God was scrubbing the slate clean. The fire burned for 4 days. When it finally died, London was gone. 80% of the city was ash. 13,000 houses destroyed. 87 churches destroyed. But the plague was gone too. The filthy, cramped, medieval timber city, the perfect habitat for the rat and the flea, had been vaporized. The fire had done in 4 days what the doctors could not do in 4 centuries. It had sterilized the wound. The silence returned, but it was the silence of a desert, a flat, gray, smoking wasteland where a capital city used to be. The survivors stood on the edge of the ruin. They were homeless. They were destitute. But they breathed in the air. It smelled of smoke. It smelled of charcoal. But it did not smell of death. The bad air had been burned away. The city of stone. When the smoke finally cleared, the survivors looked at a blank canvas. The labyrinth was gone. The twisting, dark, narrow alleys of medieval London, the places where the sun never touched the ground, had been erased. In their place was a sea of ash. And in that ash, an opportunity. The King, Charles II, issued a decree. It was a decree born of trauma. No man shall build of wood. The new city would not be organic. It would not rot. It would not burn. It would be built of brick and stone. Christopher Wren, the architect, sketched a new vision. Wide boulevards, piazzas, open spaces. He wanted to build a city of light. But this was not just about aesthetics. It was about fear. They believed that the plague hid in the shadows. They believed it thrived in stagnant air. So they built a city designed to breathe. They widened the streets so the wind could scour them clean. They built the houses with larger windows so the sun could sterilize the rooms. They were practicing urban medicine. Architecture became the cure. But beneath the new cobblestones, the old city was still there. And the dead were still there. This is the secret geometry of London, or Paris, or Naples. We walk on a crust of civilization, but just a few feet below our boots lies the history we try to forget. The great pits of 1665 were not emptied. They were simply covered over. The new city was built on the bones of the old city. In Aldgate, in Finsbury, in Tothill Fields, the ground is uneven. If you know where to look, you can see the subtle mounds. The earth settles differently where the bodies are stacked. The builders of the new brick houses knew this. They laid their foundations carefully. They tried not to dig too deep. They feared that if they broke the seal, the miasma would escape again. The ghost of the plague dictated the shape of the future. And the people changed too. The survivors of the Great Fire and the Great Plague were different from their ancestors. They were harder, they were more cynical. The medieval age, the age of unquestioning faith and superstition, had burned away in the fire. They began to trust in numbers, in bills of mortality, in insurance, in stone. They stopped looking for omens in the sky and started looking for rats in the cellar. Science was beginning to wake up. The Royal Society was meeting. They looked at the blood of the sick through new, crude microscopes. They did not see the bacteria yet. They did not see the virus. But they saw something. They saw that the world was not governed by magic, but by mechanics. And if it was a machine, it could be fixed. The era of helpless prayer was ending. The era of public health was beginning. But for the generation that lived through it, the fear never truly left. Even in the new, wide stone streets, even in the bright sunlight of the Restoration, if a man heard a cough in a crowded room, he would still flinch. He would still hold his breath, because he knew how thin the layer of stone really was. The wall of fear. We like to think that we learn. We like to think that after the fire of London, after the pits of Florence, humanity figured it out. We built stone cities. We established quarantine laws. We created borders. But the wheel turned again. 50 years after London burned, the shadow returned. This time, it fell on the sun-drenched coast of France. Marseille, 1720. The Age of Enlightenment had begun. Men were wearing powdered wigs. Philosophers were talking about liberty and reason. The medieval darkness was supposed to be a memory. But on May 25th, a ship arrived. The Grand Saint Antoine. It came from the Levant. It carried silk, valuable, shimmering silk intended for a trade fair. The captain knew he had sickness on board. Several sailors had died on the voyage. The port authorities knew the rules. The ship should have been quarantined for 40 days on an island. But money has a loud voice. The merchants whispered to the magistrates. The fair was starting soon. If the silk was late, the profits would be lost. It is just a fever, they said. The silk is clean, they said. And so greed opened the gate. The quarantine was lifted early. The cargo was unloaded. And within days, the silk weavers of Marseille began to die. It was the exact same mistake that was made in Messina in 1347. 300 years of history, 300 years of death, and nothing had changed. The human capacity for denial and the human hunger for profit remained the ultimate super spreaders. Marseille became a hellscape. But the reaction of the outside world was different this time. It was colder, more calculated. The King of France did not just close the city gates. He declared war on the city. He ordered the construction of a wall. Not a metaphorical wall, a real one. The Mur de la Peste, the wall of the plague. It was built of dry stone. It stretched for over 100 kilometers through the hills of Provence. It cut the region off from the rest of France. Soldiers were stationed along the wall, every few hundred meters, a sentry. Their orders were simple. If anyone tries to cross from the south, shoot them. Do not ask questions. Do not accept bribes. Kill them. Inside the zone, the people were trapped. Marseille collapsed. The city ran out of grave diggers. The bodies piled up in the streets, just like in London, just like in Florence. But here, the horror reached a new peak. They ran out of space in the earth. So they filled the old bastions of the city walls with corpses. And when those were full, the unthinkable happened. The streets became paved with the dead. But outside the wall, life went on. France protected itself by amputating one of its own limbs. This was the new reality of the modern age. The plague was no longer viewed as a divine punishment to be endured with prayer. It was viewed as a biological invasion to be contained with military force. The silence of Marseille was absolute, but it was a silence enforced by the barrel of a musket. The wall of the plague still stands today. You can hike along it. It is a ruin now, a line of gray stones running through the scrubland. Tourists walk past it, they take pictures, they do not know what it is. But it is a monument. It is a monument to the moment when humanity decided that survival was more important than compassion. It is a scar on the landscape that says, we will save the healthy, and we will let the sick burn. And the bacteria. It eventually died out in Marseille. The fire burned itself out. But it did not leave. It simply went back to sleep. It retreated into the reservoirs of nature, into the burrows of rodents in distant lands, waiting for the next ship, waiting for the next moment of greed, waiting for us to forget again. The glass eye. Time accelerates. The wheel spins faster. We leave the stone walls of Marseille. We cross the oceans. We enter the age of steam, the age of iron. The year is 1894. The place is Hong Kong. The city is a crowded, humid, thriving engine of the British Empire. Ships from every corner of the world dock here. But the silence has returned. It started in the slums of Taipingshire. First, the rats died. They fell from the rafters. They died in the gutters. The street cleaners swept them up by the thousands until their arms ached. The rat fall. The ancient warning. And then the people followed. But this time, there was a difference. This time, there was a man with a glass eye. Alexander Yersin, a student of Pasteur, a man of the new science. He did not come with a Bible. He did not come with a beak mask filled with spices. He came with a microscope. He built a straw hut near the hospital. He worked in the heat, surrounded by the smell of death. He bribed the guards to let him cut a bubo from a cadaver. He took the fluid, the yellow, deadly soup, and he placed it on a slide. He looked through the lens, and for the first time in human history, the monster showed its face. It was not a demon. It was not a cloud of bad air. It was not a curse from God. It was a rod, a tiny capsule-shaped stick, motionless, waiting. It took the stain of the dye. It looked under the glass like a safety pin. Yersinia pestis. He named it. After 500 years of terror, 500 years of burning Jews, drowning cats, and walling up families, we finally saw the enemy. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also a moment of profound cosmic horror. Because it was so small, this thing, this microscopic speck, had emptied London. It had ended the feudal system. It had killed half of Europe. It had no brain, it had no malice, it had no plan. It was just a biological machine. A machine designed to replicate. Yersin looked up from his microscope. He looked out at the busy harbor of Hong Kong. He realized the truth. The plague was not an event. It was not a chapter in a history book. It was an organism. And it was part of the ecosystem. It lived in the soil. It lived in the gut of the flea. It lived in the blood of the rat. We could not banish it. We could not excommunicate it. We could only manage it. The mystery was gone. The superstition was dead. But the fear did not vanish. It evolved. It became the fear of the invisible, the fear of the dirty doorknob, the fear of the unwashed hand. The silence of the church was replaced by the silence of the laboratory, the clean, white, sterile silence of the hospital ward, where death is no longer a public spectacle, but a private medical failure. Yersin wiped his brow. He packed his slides. He had found the killer. But he knew, as he watched the ships leaving the harbor, that the killer had a passport. And it was already traveling. To India, to San Francisco, to Glasgow. The third pandemic had begun. The modern world, with all its steamships and trains and telegraphs, was not a fortress. It was a superhighway for the bacteria. We had built the perfect delivery system for our own extinction. The eternal silence. And so we arrive at the end. Or rather, we arrive at now. Look out of your window. Look at the modern city, the steel towers, the glass, the electric lights that banish the darkness. We believe we have conquered the night. We believe that the silence of 1348 or 1665 can never return. We have antibiotics. We have respirators. We have data. But history is not a line. It is a layer cake. And we are just the icing on the top. Beneath the streets of London, beneath the busy commuter stations, the past is sleeping. When they dug the tunnels for the new railway lines at Liverpool Street, they found them. The Bedlam burial ground. Thousands of skeletons, packed together, teeth still intact, bones still bearing the marks of a hard life. The commuters walk above them every day. They buy their coffee, they check their phones, they rush to meetings. They do not know that they are walking on the ceiling of a tomb. And the bacteria. Yersinia pestis is not extinct. It is out there right now. It lives in the prairie dogs of America. It lives in the steppes of Central Asia. It lives in the forests of Madagascar. Every year a few people die. A hunter, a hiker, a child who played too close to a burrow. It is a quiet reminder. A reminder that we are not the masters of this planet. We are just guests. And when the next great silence comes, be it a flu, a coronavirus, or something ancient waking up from the ice, we see the same ghosts return. We saw them recently. Did you notice? When the streets emptied again, when the airports went silent, when we looked at our neighbors with suspicion, when we hoarded food, when we sought comfort in rituals, in masks, in separation. We like to think we are modern, but when the fear strikes, we are still the people of 1665. We are still the villagers of I Am, drawing lines in the dirt. We are still the citizens of Florence, locking our doors. We are still afraid of the air. The human heart does not change. It still beats the same frantic rhythm when the shadow falls. So listen. Listen to the silence of your room. It is peaceful, it is safe, but it is fragile. The noise of the world is just a temporary interruption. The silence was here before us. And one day, long after our stone cities have turned to dust, long after our names are forgotten, the silence will be here again. Waiting, always waiting.